Okay, welcome. My name is Jason Gilmore. I am the creator of the Hero Teacher Project, and I'm here with our second teacher of the year, the teacher of the year from Massachusetts, 2020, Takeru Nagayoshi. Welcome.
Hey Jason, good to be here.
Ah, good to have you here. So we're here to show the American public a little bit more about you. They've seen your portrait, but now it's time for you to give them your backstory and how you came into. You are a fairly new teacher, right? Of what was it, 5 years? Is it
7 years.
seven?
Yeah, it's my seventh year right now.
So last year was your sixth year.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is remarkable to already be Teacher of the Year in your sixth year, which is outstanding. So congratulations on that first and foremost. So here we are. We're going to learn a little bit about Takeru and why he chose this crazy profession that we call teaching and education. Um, so, uh, what and where do you teach?
Yeah. So hi again, I'm Takeru Nagayoshi. I also go by TK, so Jason, feel free to call me TK. But I'm a high school English and research teacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And yeah, I've been in the classroom for 7 years at my school in New Bedford High. And yeah, I've done ninth and 10th grade English to AP English. And this year, as I've mentioned, I'm teaching a research-based class. And so it's been pretty whirlwind of a journey, including these past 2 years teaching in a pandemic. But it's good work. And so as hard and low as the lows are, the highs also are pretty high, and it makes it worthwhile.
Hmm. So did you always want to be a teacher?
I didn't actually. If you'd ask my middle school teachers, they would be, shocked that I'm a high school teacher right now. I was a really bad student. I was a Japanese language learner. So when I was in the fourth grade, my family moved to Japan, and I really struggled academically there. Right, I spoke Japanese at home, but wasn't academically proficient in the ways that my peers were. So I kind of started off behind, and by the time I was in eighth grade, that was the year that I left Japan and came back to the States. I was so disinvested in school and education that I've internalized this idea that some kids are smart, some kids are dumb, and I am a dumb kid, and school is just not for me. And so, needless to say, didn't think that I'd be a teacher. My class rank was the lowest of the low. I think it was like a 150 out of 160 in Japan. And I would skip school. I would not go to my math class because I hated it and I didn't like the teacher there. And it really wasn't until I moved back to the States when my parents sat me down and said, "Hey, like you have to really start thinking about your life and what the rest of your your high school career is going to be. You're in the States now. It's a new leaf." And luckily, I had wonderful teachers who kind of supported me throughout the way and taught me in a way that I think a lot of Japanese classrooms didn't really push me and help me think. And so my trajectory changed there, and I got really into school, for lack of a better term, and the rest was history. And so by the time I was, graduating college, thinking about going into the classroom was an option, and here I am, 7 years later.
Wow, that is quite a journey. You were chosen as the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year in the one state. So why do you think it came down to you as being the representative for that year?
I don't know. It's a question that I ask myself every day. um, you know, I get that question a lot, right? Or how does it feel like to be sort of the best teacher in the state? Or and that's not really how I think of the teacher of the year position. It's really, you are a standard bearer. There are some things that you do in the classroom. There are some things that you do as a professional in navigating the educational space that we see as the standard that we want our teachers to do. And it's so not necessarily like there's something exceptional about you and that you therefore deserve recognition and credit. It's more around the lines of, at least how I've interpreted, you model good practices and good mindsets that I think educators should have. And so I wanted to make that clear first and foremost. I think, secondly, when I think about my own practice as a teacher and the way that I navigate education spaces, um, it's hard for me not to think of how the community that I represent is being important. So I work at a turnaround school, and so around the time that I started working at New Bedford High School, the whole district was going through these big structural changes in leadership and how the school is run. Our flagship high school for decades have been lagging in graduation rates, in test scores, right? And there was this big need and for a push for the school to change. And so I was part of this cohort of educators who were hired at the school as a part of that journey and as a part of that process. And I also remember at the time, especially in the early years of our turnaround process, that there was this sense that New Bedford High, and by extension, the city of New Bedford, was a failed city, a failed school district and institution. And it had this self-fulfilling prophecy where you would hear students say from their mouths, and even colleagues and other teachers say that, this is not a good school. I can't believe, right, you're working at New Bedford.
Mhm.
And there's just this stigma, right, that I felt was hard to shake off. And that stigma never really aligned with the things that I was seeing in my own classroom, the wonderful things that my kids were doing and achieving. And so I felt like there was this need to say, actually, regardless of what you might have been hearing in the media about our city, about our kids, about what's happening in our schools, there is excellence here in abundance. There are brilliant things taking place at the student level, at the leadership level, at the teacher level. And just because we are a city that has historically struggled, right, according to those test scores, it doesn't mean that we can't or that we won't. And I want to show you, right, that that's not the case. And so a lot of us teachers were sort of a part of this push and this new effort to show the community and to show the state that we're not going to let these external factors define us and that we can overcome those challenges. And particularly, right, as an AP teacher, I was able to get a lot of success academically with my students and make and achieve records in terms of AP passing scores at our school that we haven't seen in very long years. And so I think those were some of the factors that DESE, right, our Massachusetts Department of Education, saw as something representative of the type of leadership, teacher leadership that they wanted to see modeled after. So that's a long-winded way of guessing as to some of the reasons why they might have thought that I could be a good teacher of the year. You look at the ways in which schools are funded, and a lot of it comes down to property tax, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so if you're looking at a public school in a city like New Bedford, for instance, where as a gateway city over the past decades, a lot of more affluent families moved away from the area. There was a lot of employment opportunities that also moved away, right? Especially as economy shifted from more of an industrial era to a service-based economy. And then on top of that, we had a lot of immigrant populations from the Cape Verde, from Portugal, from Puerto Rico, and different places of the world come, right? And our school systems and our sort of political civic infrastructure at the city of New Bedford wasn't prepared to support their linguistic needs, their sort of living needs. And I think there was a confluence of factors that made it so that the city had lost its way of being able to support the kind of quality education that it has been able to over the past decades. It goes back to that resource point that you were making as well. And so when you compare that to these school districts in these suburban areas that are majority white and more from affluent areas, obviously you see a correlation to higher academic output and outcomes as well. And so, yeah, I've always been attuned to sort of the broader structural issues and the way that plays out in our school districts. And I think in Massachusetts in particular, right, we get this praise a lot of giving a lot of high academic achievements and outcomes, but when you really disaggregate the data, there's vast inequities. And we're one of the most segregated cities. But one thing that I found incredibly eye-opening was that not only are we segregated by race and class, but if you were to compare a map of racial and class segregation to the educational right outcome, right, they essentially look exactly the same, right? And so again, as a teacher who works at a Title I school like New Bedford, I've always been attuned to those systemic inequities and felt that as an educator, it's important to highlight that, right? And give narrative and voice and a face to some of the challenges that we as educators might face in a school system like this.
So how
Yeah.
would your teaching have changed if you had worked in a different school?
It's hard to say, right? I haven't worked at a suburban school or an affluent district. And so I think each school community and district has its own unique challenges. And so I wouldn't say one is more harder than the other. I think they manifest, right, in different ways. I will say that when we think about the challenges at a school like mine, a low income urban Title I school, they tend to be related to these structural issues, those of systemic poverty, difficulties around transportation, kids coming from homes where substance abuse or gang affiliation or just having undocumented parents or family members who don't speak English being reasons for why students might not always be able to prioritize their schoolwork. When I check in with my kids, right, about some of the reasons why, for instance, over the spring pandemic last year, hey, I noticed that you haven't been coming to my Zoom class. What's the reason why? A lot of the things that I would hear are reflective of the population that we teach. Hey, Mr. Nagayoshi, sorry I didn't go to your class. I was taking care of my younger brother because I'm the only, person who can take care of my younger siblings when, because my parents are working. Hey, Mr. Nagayoshi, I'm sorry I wasn't there because I have a work shift and my parents were laid off and I'm the one who has to help pay for the bills. Hey, Mr. Nagayoshi, I'm sorry I didn't come because, you know, I don't want to sacrifice my smartphone data just to go to your class. Hey, Mr. Nagayoshi, I'm depressed and there's just a lot going on in my family because my family members died of COVID, right? Those are the sort of big issues that impact our school community. And as teachers who work, as educators who work in communities like this, it's hard to get to the point of being able to prioritize just academic when there are all these other socioeconomic, socio-emotional concerns that we have to constantly keep our pulse on, right? And so I think those are the unique challenges that exist at a school system like mine. And to be a successful teacher in a system like this, you always have to be attentive to balancing the academic with those other supports that oftentimes, as a result of the broken aspects of our system, that we as educators need to overcompensate for.
So something interesting that you had just said there is that all those little interactions that you're talking about with your students, um, from after my conversation with your students, after visiting the class, uh, they all agreed that the best part of your teaching is actually not your teaching. it,
Uh,
it's the relationship that you build with them. It's the environment that you create in the classroom that those conversations that you just illustrated, they can happen.
yeah,
I think yes, of course they're actually learning the content that you're supposed to be teaching and are teaching, um, and you're obviously giving it to them in a digestible manner. I mean, I witnessed your lesson on Shakespeare, and I totally got it. I know what you were trying to get to with the kids, and the conversation really flowed. My I gotta say, to be honest, I wish my conversations flowed as easily as yours did as I saw your kids online. Uh, that was pretty magical to see the concurrent teaching that you were doing was working. You may have thought that it was not ideal, but it looked ideal. Uh,
thank you for
yeah,
that feedback.
yeah,
But even to the point that you're making about students saying, "Hey, well, the best part of Nagayoshi isn't his teaching; it's his relationship with us, right?" And I'd say, like as teachers, right, we feel our best not like in terms of what we can do academically with our students. It is also the relationship. Like ask most teachers, and they will tell you what brings them joy is the relationship, the work that they're able to do with their kids, right? And the community and the culture that they have within their classroom. And I think that goes to show the importance of that human element that is oftentimes so made transactional by these new expectations that we have around testing, or just learning being the primary focus and center of everything that we do in an institution like at a school. But I think the reality is a little bit more um, complex than that. And when I think of relationship, like relationships are important, as what they are, but they're also the vehicle through which we get to the content, because kids don't learn from people that I don't like, and kids don't care about how much you know, right, unless they know that you care about them. And so it's just important that all these things are understood, and sometimes for a school community like mine, that care element just as pronounced in some other ways that I think other more affluent communities don't necessarily always have to think about. And keeping your pulse on it is important, but also exhausting.
How do you feel about flexibility with your
I
work?
think flexibility is key, right? You want to be high in expectations, but like low in rigidity, right? I forgot where I heard that quote from, but I love that idea that, like, in term, you have to understand that you're working with people, right? And people process content, have different value systems, different personalities, and also different life circumstances that have unique individualized journeys. And yet our school system by and large is this sort of industrial model where everyone needs to be taught and assessed in the same way. And as a teacher, you're kind of towing between those two lines. As a purveyor of that system, who is still expected to teach kids to the test and have them all in rows of desks, and you as a lecturer, is the person who has knowledge, but also someone who um, recognizes that fault, that system and that way that school has been conceptualized for decades, centuries even, is not the best way, nor does it match the reality of the students that we work with. And so you're right, right? My default is to say, hey, here are my expectations, here are the deadlines, and here's how we're going to get there. But the reality is that when things, uh, throughout that process, kids have difficulty. And in those cases, I have to do my best to meet them halfway, to have a conversation with them, and say, well, if this is something that you can't meet, tell me why, right? And how is it that I can help you in that process? I think more than ever, our students are in need of people who can help them with those soft skills around how to organize themselves, how to plan, and also how to communicate when they're having a difficult time. And so I try to do my best in letting my students know that if you're having, right, difficulty with X, Y, and Z, that in itself is not problematic, because life does happen, right? What's problematic is if you keep to yourself, you don't say anything, you put your head down, and you hope that me as a teacher won't notice, because that's not going to happen as long as if you're in my class. I'll never get mad at you for not understanding a concept, right? I'll never get disappointed at you for meeting a deadline. But what I do want is for us to have a conversation and negotiate something together, right? And those are the skills that I think increasingly our students aren't given the opportunity to develop. Um, and so as a teacher who is a part of this system, right, especially like AP and the type of rigor that it entails, it is hard, because sometimes that balance that you have to toe feels precarious. But I think even as a personal educator who has gone through a lot of difficulties myself, I want to be able to understand my kids through that lens of compassion, and then think of some of the self-advocacy and solution building skills that all of us need to know to navigate the world once we're outside of the school system. Because unfortunately, the real world is equally cruel and not as understanding as it is either. And so, how can I use my classroom and my vehicle and the content in a way that helps them build some of those skills around, you know, communication and organization and, you know, self advocacy.
It sounds like you're saying that growth is more important than proficiency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although we know we do want them to be proficient and master as much as possible. But really, I mean, there's how many kids are actually, would you say, end up mastering
Yeah.
all of the skills that you're trying to give them?
Yeah. Very few. I'll give you an example. I hope my kids don't hear this. They just finished their AP exam. And just based off of the trends and data at our school, I would be very proud if over 50% passed their AP Lit exam. And by the way, that figure isn't any different from the global average. It is a really difficult test. But I tell my students, even if you get a 2, right, which is below the minimum qualifying score out of a 5, I am still so proud of you, right? Because my goal as a teacher was for us to be pushed from wherever we came in our school. And I'm really proud of the fact that we do this, have an open enrollment in our AP. And so we have anywhere between kids who knew that they were going to go to and wanted to aim for an Ivy League school to students who were just placed in the class, never taken an AP class before, but wanted to challenge themselves for that year. And as a result of that, we get all sorts of different skill sets, different orientations towards work, right? And my role, my job is to say, well, regardless of where you're at, I want to push you through. And sure, it'll be nice if you can pass because you can get that college credit. But in many ways, that college credit, that passing score is a cherry on top of an ice cream sundae, because that ice cream sundae is the fact that you've made it through this whole year, that you've pushed yourself and that you never gave up, that you've learned a lot about what it means to analyze text. And those are skills that you can apply for the rest of your life. And even though you might have not have been able to demonstrate those skills in a way that gets you proficiency, you have to realize that that was just one test that was timed, right, in a certain part of your development. And just because you couldn't get there on that day doesn't mean that you don't have those skills, right? It means that you'll get there one day. And so never see that as a reflection of who you are. And that's the kind of, I think, mindset that I want my kids to understand about what their learning is. Because when we overemphasize grades, when we overemphasize test scores, I think what's lost a lot in that process is what learning is about, what growth and self-development is about. And so I do agree with you. It's about growth more than proficiency.
So if you could wave your magic wand and just make public education, or at least something around your school, if you want to keep it local, policy, whatever, what is it that you would change that would make learning better for your students?
Ooh. I would want, I mean, there's a lot of things I would want, but I would want every child to have like a coach, like like a life coach, someone who can help them not just with their academic struggles that they're going through, but an adult in their life who can help them with, their identity development, the socio emotional concerns that they're having, help them communicate and understand who they are in a way that connects them to their next steps. And I think the unfortunate part is that a lot of our students don't have a person in their life like that. And if your parents and family members, are supports like that, that's awesome. But oftentimes kids don't have that luxury. And I think schools position a lot of teachers to see their kids more as, I think there's something in the school structure that makes our relationship with students, especially at the high school level as content instruction folks, that make our relationship with students feel so transactional. And even I, as a teacher, with this mindset, I'm so aware that of the 100 kids that I have, there are a lot of kids whom I don't develop that depth and degree of relationship with, and I probably don't have that kind of impact on them in the way that you've heard my other students that you've interviewed, right? And I think that's not right. I want every student to have someone like that. I think about who I became, and I told you a little bit earlier about when I moved back to the States, I had a lot of educators. One of the coaches, right, so to speak, that I had was my neighbor. Her name is Janet, and she's a deep family friend of mine. But she would come home. I would come home, and then she would look over my essays every time I had an assignment, and she'd walk me through and tell me all of the ways
Wow.
the language could have been improved. She would support me and look through my college application, and was just an adult in my life who allowed me to be reflective about my own learning, to feel vulnerable about the mistakes that I was making as a writer, and to kind of guide me throughout this process, not just academically, but emotionally as well. And I think every child deserves that kind of um, one-on-one support, but there's just something in our system that makes a lot of our relations feel transactional. And so pie in the sky, but it's a magic wand question. And so that's what I'd say.
Hmm. I think that would be outstanding. I mean, we try to get there with the advisory, but you still have what, I don't know, 20 or so kids per advisor or so at least. If
Yep.
not more. It's not,
I have
quite the
20 kids.
one-on-one situation you're describing.
Yeah. I got 20 kids, 40 minutes. Half of them are virtual. And then on the days that we do have advisory lessons, we have PowerPoint presentations, we have announcements that we need to show. You never really get to that point of having these conversations with kids, right? About their dreams, their aspirations, what makes them tick, and what motivates them. And yeah, they, yeah, I don't want kids leaving school feeling like there was an adult that they felt connected to. But I think, unfortunately, that is the reality of how a lot of kids end up leaving the school system.
Sure. I mean, class sizes should be smaller, right?
Uh,
And a life coach per kid. If they had like 5 kids per life coach, wouldn't that be fantastic? You know, what would you think, other than straight up funding, what do you think would get in the way of going towards that way, where we having just more teachers? Like, why can't we have more teachers?
I think teaching is not a desirable profession for a lot of people.
Oh,
It's not, right? You've heard of the refrain, those who can't do teach. And by and large, I think there are large segments of uh, the population in this country where teaching is not seen as an admirable career. And those perceptions are reinforced by the fact that we're compensated very little. Um, and so our best and our brightest and those who have these creative visions and would hold the school and educational systems accountable and would advocate for more equitable outcomes aren't really flocking to the profession, right, so to speak. And even and particularly at schools like mine, um, the supply side, right, is even lower, and we see that even more pronounced in certain teaching categories like special education, ESL, STEM fields, and so I know we talked about funding, but I think changing the public narrative around educators and celebrating them and making this a profession where people, and especially our most passionate minds, want to go into is such a big um, dream and vision of mine. And so in some ways, right, like this teacher hero project falls directly under this dream and this vision, because it's saying, no, like teachers do make a difference, and they are incredible, and we need more educators who look at work this way. And so I also wanted to send some love your way too.
I appreciate that. Well, we've talked about a lot about school and school structure, and you know how it works for you and what you've been able to accomplish, and how how you've become effective even when your uh, um, the challenges are this huge for you
Mhm.
in your position and where you're at, and for your students as well. But look at the result, right? Look at this background that I have has nothing to do. It's not my. It's a virtual background, and it is a photo from TK's class. It is he's got this meticulously organized classroom, except for this one area, which is uh, accolades, and just we talk about all those important relationship connections that you have to have with your students to get to the level of success that TK has. Well, here's the result. They go out of their way to send him a thank you or a maybe even just a check-in about what they're doing. So please explain what I have behind me.
It's my wall of of letters and pictures and artifacts that I've collected over the course of the years. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Um, so like I always tell my kids like I don't need gifts or anything. The thing that matters the most to me are your words of how I've impacted you. And every time I get a letter from a student or a colleague or anyone related to the work that I do in education, it means so much to me because it's what keeps me going. It keeps me grounded, and it reminds me of the work that yeah. And so that wall, in many ways, is just a reminder of why I teach and the impact that I've had, and it keeps me motivated, especially on days where the work gets tough, right? And it gets hard to keep on keeping on. And so, yeah, people say that it reminds them of like a conspiracy theorist's board. It's just a red yarn away from just being total chaos. Yeah, yeah, to connect all the dots. But it's my wall of love and it's nice to kind of look back and see all the students and the classes that I've had and the memories that I've made with them. And again, like that's why we go into the classroom. And so um, we talked about relationship in terms of like the impact that it has on students, but like talk about the impact that it has on teachers, right? Yeah. So we talk about how relationships are central to students, but you know the same concept applies for teachers too. If you want to keep teachers invested, and if you want to you know keep teachers in the classroom and not have them quit, you know what is it that we can do at the school system level that really centers that relationship and allows us to feel those mutually fulfilling relational pieces of our work that make it feel so gratifying and worthwhile.
Hmm.
Another big part of my work that I do as a teacher is representing the different identities that I hold, right? I'm a first generation Japanese American. I'm bilingual, I'm Asian American, and I'm gay. And the reality, especially in Massachusetts, right, is that 80% of our educators are white. And we also know that in the education field, it's disproportionately female. And compare that with the 40% of our students who are of color, right? And so for me, leaning into my own identity and saying that there are many different ways to exist and represent your own culture, your own perspective that you have that's unique, you know, as a result of your identity was also an important piece and is central to a lot of the leadership work that I do as a teacher leader, but also as an educator in my classroom and helping students get a way of navigating and understanding who they are and what their identities are should be seen as an asset and in a way that connects to the way that they navigate the world.
Have you found it to be an asset? I'm in terms of being able to support kids that are questioning their identity and really struggling with it.
Yeah, I think I have. I think in America we have this sort of reluctance to talk about race and to talk about identity, and there shouldn't be, right? We all have these different identities, and there are implications and historical connotations to those identities. And what's important is that we find a sense of familiarity within our own selves and have a way of celebrating and recognize the strengths that that brings, but also the same empathy and love that we grant ourselves to the different communities that and that we're a part of in the identities that we hold, we should be able to see that in others as well. And being and having all these different identities puts me in the intersection of all these different groups. And I think that allows me to feel more empathetic towards other people and the struggles that different groups and communities of color might experience, and have a pulse, right, on how we think and talk about structural issues in our society related to equity and oppression. And I'm in the mindset that we're all stronger when we're together, and that our oppression is tied, uh, but so is our liberation, right? Tied together. And the more that we're able to come together as a collective, while still understanding, right, and recognizing the inherent differences within, the better we are together. And that's more important than ignoring that these things exist and pretending like they're not important. And silencing conversations related to that, which is something that's happening as of late. That's not how I've navigated the world, and so this is one way that I navigate the classroom, at least personally for me, because being gay, being Asian, those are things that I just can't turn off when I'm in the classroom. It's things that people see in me, and these are things that people notice in me. And so rather than hiding it or ignoring it or pretending like it's not a part of who I am, it's important to say, yeah, this is what it is. And let's talk about it, right? And just like how I have that journey, all of my students and every single person has their own unique journey when it comes to their identities as well. And I think it's important to get to a society where we can have discourse around that.
I want the Hero Teacher Project to emphasize that, yeah, we do have people of color that are teachers in this country, and they should be celebrated. And I hope that from this, some more that we get more recruits, more people coming on to teach that are people of color.
Mhm.
Um, why do you think that there just aren't enough? What is your theory?
From just the educational opportunity gaps that exist amongst communities of color. A lot of people of color, especially from BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, POC communities, have expressed that their own educational experiences weren't good. They didn't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. They were targeted for disciplinary action. None of their teachers were role models because they didn't understand their upbringing or cultural context, or treated them in ways that were biased. And so I think there's just a lot, in addition to sort of the systemic barriers of college educational attainment, the certification process that also serves as a gatekeeping mechanism for a lot of low income people of color, that make it so that education historically hasn't been um, a place where at least in the state of Massachusetts, people of color sort of went to. And I think to this more broader ideological point is, well, if you don't see yourself represented in a certain profession, then it's hard for you to imagine yourself being in that position.
Right.
And so if I'm a Black boy, let's say, and I went through my K-12 education experience only seeing white women, and white women who didn't really speak to the unique concerns or the worldview, or the realities that I've experienced, I would leave the education system thinking, at best, this is not a space for people like me. And at worst, being disinvested in that process because constantly I'm told or I feel as though I'm measured against a standard by a set of people who don't represent necessarily the lived experience that I have. And so I think diversifying the teacher workforce, making sure that there are different educators in the classroom, and then celebrating, right, a pluralities of identities is so important, to say that like anyone can be a teacher. There's so many different ways of being a teacher, um, and we need, right, more teachers of color and different identities in the classroom, so that the future generation can also feel inspired to join the profession as well. And so I think that's why something like the Teacher Hero Project does a really wonderful job in celebrating different types of identities and different types of teachers in all of the states, and sends this wonderful message that excellence and this profession can come in many shapes and sizes. And there's a space for everyone.
Sounds like the way it should be. Um, well, PK, it's been. I feel like I've been educated. Like, I'm the one coming up with these questions.
Thank you.
I
You asked.
get it. I get it. I get what your students are talking
I hope so. I sometimes I'm like, I don't even know what I'm saying.
about. And because I mean they were listening, they listened, and the coolest thing is that they're like they said, oh, there's one thing different about Mr. Nagayoshi. He never gives us any tests. I'm like, what? There's no tests, no quizzes? No, no tests and no quizzes. Oh, so he assesses you with different methods. He's like, yeah, and they're really hard, but they're not as painful. So just listening to your students, it shows that why you're teacher of the year. Um, and so I'm going to say thank you for giving me your time and sharing, making me smarter in just just an hour or so. Um, and thank you for your service and everything that you do for your students. We are definitely should be celebrating the work that you do. So thank you, Mr. Nagayoshi.
Thank you, Jason, for having me. It's wonderful reflecting with you.
Excellent.